like, subscribe, and share. Story 1: The Echoes of the Abandoned Factory. It was an unseasonably cold October night when 5 friends decided to explore the old manufacturing plant that had stood empty for decades on the edge of town. The factory loomed like a giant ghost against the skyline, its silhouette marked by jagged, broken windows and a rusted metal sign hanging crooked above the entrance. Most of the townspeople avoided it, especially at night. Stories circulated about strange sounds, sightings, and the workers who had gone missing before the factory's abrupt closure years ago. The friends Lily, Sam, Derek, Eden, and me were thrill seekers by nature, always up for an adventure. Lily, the unofficial leader of the group, had suggested the factory as a late-night destination. "Come on, guys, imagine the stories we could tell afterward," she had insisted, her voice full of excitement. Reluctantly, the others agreed, though they couldn't ignore the unease they felt as they approached the looming structure. Armed with flashlights and a sense of daring, the 5 friends squeezed through a gap in the rusty chain-link fence surrounding the building. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying the faint smell of oil and dust. Their flashlights cut through the dark as they made their way through a maze of twisted metal and crumbling walls. "Are we sure this place is safe?" Sam whispered, his eyes darting around. "Relax," Lily replied with a grin. "It's just an old factory. Besides, no one's been here for years." But as they ventured further inside, they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The factory was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak or distant drip of water echoing through the cavernous halls. Every so often, they would stop, shining their flashlights around at the rusted machines and piles of debris, only to hear their own breathing filling the silence. They finally reached the main production area, massive room lined with conveyor belts, towering metal presses, and forgotten tools scattered about like relics of a bygone era. The atmosphere was oppressive, heavy with the weight of years of disuse. "Let's split up and explore," Lily suggested, her excitement undiminished. The others exchanged nervous glances, but they reluctantly agreed, each of them choosing a different section of the room to explore. Lily and Sam headed toward the old offices, while Derek, Eden, and Mia spread out through the production floor. As they ventured deeper, Derek heard something strange, a faint, rhythmic tapping. He stopped, shining his flashlight in all directions, but there was nothing around him except for shadows. The sound continued, faint but persistent, as if coming from somewhere deep within the walls. "Guys," he called out, his voice echoing through the empty space. "Do you hear that?" Eden and Mia joined him, their faces lit by the eerie glow of their flashlights. They stood in silence, straining their ears. For a moment, there was nothing, just the quiet of the factory. Then, suddenly, they all heard a soft, distant whisper, just barely audible, coming from somewhere in the darkness. "Who's there?" Eden called out, his voice tense. There was no response, only the soft echo of his own voice fading into the shadows. They looked at each other, uneasy but too stubborn to turn back just yet. Meanwhile, in the offices, Lily and Sam were going through old paperwork, marveling at the yellowed memos and dust-covered ledgers left behind, as if the workers had simply walked out one day, never to return. "Look at this," Sam whispered, pointing to a date on one of the papers. "October 13th, 1974. That's the day the factory closed down." Lily's eyes widened. Why'd they close it anyway? Sam shook his head. "No one knows for sure. Some say there was an accident, a few workers went missing, and the factory shut down overnight. They say their bodies were never found." As he spoke, a loud clang echoed through the building, making both of them jump. It sounded like something heavy had been knocked over in the production area. They turned to see Derek, Eden, and Mia running toward them, their faces pale. "Did you hear that?" Derek asked, his voice a mix of fear and excitement. Lily nodded, gripping her flashlight tightly. Maybe it's just an animal, or maybe. She trailed off, but the others caught her drift. Or maybe, Aiden whispered, it's one of the workers. They exchanged nervous smiles, each of them half joking but half believing. Despite their shared bravado, the group huddled closer together as they continued exploring, moving down a narrow hallway lined with lockers. The air felt colder here, the silence pressing down on them like a weight. As they walked, they began hearing faint, disjointed sounds, the creak of metal, the soft shuffle of footsteps. They stopped, their flashlights illuminating the narrow passage. But there was nothing there. Maybe we should head back, Mia suggested, her voice barely a whisper. Lily nodded, but just as they turned to leave, they heard it again, a distant, sorrowful whisper drifting through the hall. It was a woman's voice. Help me. They froze, their eyes wide with fear. Did you hear that? Sam asked, his voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, the lights from their flashlights flickered, and for a brief moment, the hallway was plunged into darkness. When the lights steadied, they noticed something chilling. They were not alone. Standing at the end of the hallway was a figure, barely visible in the dim light. She wore what looked like a factory uniform, her head bent, her form slightly hunched. She was almost translucent, as if she were a reflection in a fog mirror. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. They simply stared, paralyzed with fear as the figure slowly raised her head, revealing hollow, sorrowful eyes that seemed to pierce straight through them. Help me, she whispered again, her voice a faint echo that lingered in the air. The friends turned and ran, their footsteps pounding against the cold concrete floor as they sprinted through the factory, desperate to escape. They didn't stop until they reached the exit, and even then they kept running, not daring to look back. Outside, they gasped for breath, the cold night air filling their lungs as they tried to make sense of what they had just seen. What was that? Mia stammered, her face pale. I don't know, Garrick replied, still shaken. But it felt real, like she was trapped there waiting. They fell silent, each of them haunted by the memory of the figure in the hallway. They had come looking for a thrill, but they had found something far darker, something that would linger in their minds long after that night. As they drove away, none of them noticed the faint, ghostly figure watching them from one of the factory's broken windows, her hollow eyes filled with an endless, silent plea. Help me. That night, each of them lay awake in bed, unable to escape the image of the sorrowful figure they had seen. They tried to convince themselves that it was just a trick of the light, an illusion brought on by the eerie atmosphere of the old factory. But in the days that followed, strange things began to happen. Sam started hearing faint whispers whenever he was alone, soft voices calling his name. Lily began seeing shadowy figures in her peripheral vision, disappearing the moment she turned to look. And Aiden swore he saw the same woman from the factory standing at the foot of his bed one night, her empty eyes watching him with a silent plea. One by one, they each experienced inexplicable events, as if the spirit they had encountered was following them, unable to rest. They tried to ignore it, hoping the strange occurrences would eventually fade, but the ghostly presence grew stronger, invading their lives with an increasing sense of dread. Desperate, they decided to return to the factory, hoping to find a way to put the spirit to rest. But when they arrived, they found that the building had been torn down, replaced by a fenced-off construction site. It's gone, Mia whispered, her voice filled with despair. We can't help her now. As they stood there, staring at the empty lot where the factory had once stood, they each felt an overwhelming sense of loss, as though they had failed to fulfill a promise they hadn't even known they had made. They returned to their lives, but the experiences continued to haunt them, a constant reminder of the spirit they had left behind. And every so often, in the dead of night, they would hear her voice again, soft and sorrowful, drifting through the darkness with a single, mournful plea. Help me. The haunting had only just begun, a relentless echo that would follow them forever reminding them of the factory and the restless spirit trapped within its walls. Story 2. Lost on the Foggy Road Home. It was nearly midnight when Josh left the office. He had stayed late to finish a big project, and now the office parking lot was nearly deserted, his car one of the last remaining. Josh stifled a yawn as he climbed into his sedan, trying to shake off the weariness that hung over him. It had been a long day, and he was eager to get home, take a shower, and fall into bed. The city streets were empty as he started driving, the orange glow of streetlights passing by in a soothing rhythm. The drive home was normally a simple one, a straight shot out of the city and onto a stretch of highway leading to the quiet suburb where he lived. But tonight, something felt different. About 10 minutes into his drive, a heavy fog began to roll in, thick and white, spreading over the road like a ghostly blanket. Josh turned on his headlights, but the fog was so dense that it seemed to swallow the beams, reducing visibility to just a few feet in front of him. He felt a slight twinge of unease as he slowed down, his eyes straining to make out the lines of the road. Fog was rare around here, especially this thick. Still, he told himself, it was just fog, nothing to worry about. As he drove deeper into the fog, his GPS began to act strangely. The screen flickered, and the familiar voice giving directions suddenly cut out, replaced by static. Josh frowned, tapping the screen. "Come on, don't do this now," he muttered. But the GPS wouldn't respond, the map freezing on a blank screen before shutting off entirely. Josh sighed, glancing around at the fog-shrouded road. He knew the way well enough, so he decided to keep going, assuming the GPS would reset eventually. But then he noticed something odd. The road didn't look right. The buildings he'd passed seemed unfamiliar, like he was driving through a part of town he'd never seen before. He slowed down, squinting through the windshield as he tried to get his bearings. The usual landmarks were gone, no street signs, no familiar stores or gas stations. Just old, dilapidated buildings and flickering streetlights casting an eerie glow through the fog. A chill crept over him as he realized he was no longer sure where he was. The road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, disappearing into the fog. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Maybe he had just made a wrong turn. He'd been tired, after all. All he needed to do was turn around and retrace his steps. Josh made a U-turn, heading back the way he'd come. But after a few minutes, the road ahead looked just as unfamiliar as before. There were no intersections, no exits, only the same stretch of fog-shrouded road, stretching into the dark. The chill grew stronger as he drove on, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The air inside the car felt colder, and a strange, metallic scent filled the space, sharp and unpleasant. Josh rolled down the window, hoping for a breath of fresh air, but the fog crept inside, swirling around him like icy tendrils. He shivered, quickly rolling the window back up. Panic began to settle in as he realized that he had no idea where he was or how to get back. He glanced at his phone, hoping to pull up a map, but it wouldn't connect. The screen showed no service, and every attempt to restart it failed. "Great," he muttered, his voice shaky. "Just great." He kept driving, hoping that eventually he would find some sign of civilization, a road sign, anything to orient himself. But the fog only grew thicker, pressing in on all sides, reducing visibility to almost nothing. It felt as though he were the only person left in a strange, empty world. Then, out of the mist, a shape began to emerge in the distance, a faint, dim light flickering through the fog. Relieved, he sped up, hoping it was a gas station or a store where he could ask for directions. But as he drew closer, he saw that it wasn't a building. It was a small, lone streetlight, casting a pale glow over an old, crumbling road sign. He slowed down, squinting at the sign through the mist. The letters were worn, barely legible, but he could just make them out. Welcome to Ravenswood." Josh frowned. He'd never heard of a town called Ravenswood. He hadn't even known there was one near where he lived. His pulse quickened, the strange sense of unease growing stronger. How had he ended up in a town he'd never heard of? The buildings around him looked old and abandoned, their windows dark, their facades crumbling. There were no cars, no people, just empty streets and lifeless buildings shrouded in the dense fog. He decided to keep driving, hoping to find someone who could give him directions. As he drove, he noticed that some of the buildings had faded signs hanging above their doors. Names like Ravenswood Diner and Sam's Hardware. It looked like an old-fashioned small town, frozen in time and touched by modern life. After a few blocks, he saw a faint light flickering in the window of a small diner. Relief washed over him as he parked his car and climbed out, the cold, damp air chilling him to the bone. He walked up to the door, peering through the fog glass. Inside, he could see a figure, a woman, her back turned to him as she wiped down the counter. The lights inside were dim, casting an eerie glow over the empty tables and chairs. Josh hesitated, a strange feeling of dread creeping over him. But he needed directions, and she was the only sign of life he'd seen in this strange place. He pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling softly. The woman didn't turn around. He cleared his throat, his voice echoing through the silent diner. "Excuse me." The woman froze, her hand pausing mid-wipe, as though she hadn't heard him come in. Slowly, she turned to face him, and Josh felt his breath catch in his throat. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and empty, as though she were looking straight through him. Her expression was blank, void of any emotion. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence stretching on, thick and oppressive. Finally, she spoke, her voice flat and monotone. "You shouldn't be here." Josh swallowed, his mouth dry. I got lost. I was just looking for directions." She continued to stare at him, unblinking. "No one leaves Ravenswood," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. A chill ran down his spine. He forced a nervous laugh, trying to break the tension. "Look, I just need to know how to get back to the highway. I must have taken a wrong turn." The woman's gaze didn't waver. "There is no way back." Panic began to set in. He took a step back, glancing over his shoulder toward the door. But before he could move, the lights in the diner flickered, and he heard the faint sound of whispering coming from somewhere behind him. He turned slowly, his heart pounding as he searched the shadows for the source of the voices. But the diner was empty, just empty tables and chairs, bathed in dim, flickering light. When he turned back to the woman, she was gone. The diner was empty, silent. His pulse quickened as he stumbled back out into the fog, the eerie whispering following him as he made his way to his car. He climbed inside, slamming the door and locking it, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Get a hold of yourself," he muttered. It's just an old town." But as he looked out through the windshield, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the distance, barely visible through the fog, was a row of figures, standing in the street, their shapes just shadows against the mist. They were watching him, motionless, their faces obscured by the darkness. Heart pounding, he threw the car into reverse, his tires screeching as he backed away. The figures didn't move, didn't chase him. They simply watched as he sped down the road, desperate to escape. But no matter how far he drove, he couldn't find his way out. Every turn, every road, seemed to lead him back to the same empty streets, the same silent buildings. The fog clung to him, thick and unyielding, trapping him in a town that shouldn't exist. Hours passed, though it felt like an eternity. Exhausted, he finally stopped the car, slumping over the wheel, defeated. He closed his eyes, the whispers echoing in his mind, the faces of the figures haunting him. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in his car. He was standing in the street, surrounded by the foggy, empty town stretching endlessly before him. And as he looked down, he realized with a sickening dread that he was one of them now, a figure in the mist, forever trapped in the ghostly town of Ravenswood. Story 3. The Last Train Ride. Jenna worked long hours at a corporate job in the city, often staying late to meet deadlines. Tonight was no different. She had stayed until nearly midnight, when her office building was deserted, save for a few cleaning staff. She packed her things, too tired to feel anything but the urge to go home. As she left the office and walked toward the subway station, a deep quiet hung over the streets, the city's usual hum reduced to a faint whisper. She descended the stairs to the subway platform, hoping to catch the last train of the night. The platform was empty, lit by harsh, fluorescent lights that flickered occasionally. It wasn't unusual for the station to be empty this late, but tonight it felt different. Jenna felt a prickling unease as she stood by the edge of the platform, glancing up at the digital clock overhead. 12:03 a.m. The last train was supposed to arrive at 12:05. As she waited, Jenna noticed a figure standing at the far end of the platform, a janitor, clad in a faded uniform, with his back to her, sweeping the floor in slow, deliberate strokes. Something about him seemed off. His posture was too stiff, and he didn't look up or acknowledge her presence. Normally, the cleaning staff would give a polite nod or smile, but this man seemed lost in his work, oblivious to her. She shrugged it off, brushing aside the feeling as paranoia from a long day. But when the clock ticked to 12:05, the train hadn't arrived. She sighed, figuring there was a delay. It wasn't unusual for the last trains to be late, especially at this hour. 5 minutes passed, then 10, still no train. Jenna grew impatient, her unease growing stronger. She glanced down the tracks, but all she saw was a yawning tunnel stretching into darkness. The janitor was still sweeping at the far end of the platform, moving in slow, methodical patterns. She noticed now that his movements seemed too repetitive, like he was stuck in a loop. Finally, she heard the rumble of a train approaching. She exhaled, relieved, as the distant headlights illuminated the tunnel. But as the train rolled into the station, Jenna's relief turned to confusion and then to dread. The train was old, far older than the regular subway trains, with a faded, rusted exterior and grimy windows. The logo on the side looked ancient, the letters barely legible. She squinted, realizing it read Metro Transit Authority, a name she'd only ever seen in history books. The train doors slid open with a groaning sound, and the interior lights flickered dimly, casting eerie shadows inside. For a moment, she considered waiting for another train, but the platform was empty, and she didn't want to risk missing the last ride home. She stepped inside, the doors closing behind her with a heavy clang. The carriage was empty, save for a few seats with torn fabric and rusted metal poles. The air was thick and musty, carrying a faint, metallic scent. She took a seat near the door, clutching her bag tightly, and glanced around the carriage. The train jolted to life, moving forward with a shudder. Jenna stared out the window, watching the dimly lit tunnel pass by, trying to shake the eerie feeling that something was wrong. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the sound of the train rattling along the tracks. But then, she noticed something odd. The train wasn't stopping at any stations. They passed platform after platform, but the train didn't slow down. It simply hurtled through each stop, leaving dark, empty platforms behind. Her phone showed no service. She tried to text a friend, but the messages wouldn't go through. She could feel the unease growing, settling deep in her stomach. Just then, she heard a faint noise, a shuffling sound, coming from the far end of the carriage. She turned, her eyes widening as she saw a figure standing there. It was the janitor. He was staring at her, his face pale and expressionless, his eyes dark and empty. He held his broom loosely in one hand, his body swaying slightly with the motion of the train. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask why he was there, but no words came out. The janitor's mouth twisted into a strange smile, a hollow, eerie expression that didn't reach his eyes. He took a step forward, his gaze locked onto hers. What are you doing here?" Jenna managed to stammer, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head, his gaze piercing and unblinking. Slowly, he raised his broom, pointing it at the seat next to her. Jenna felt a chill run down her spine as she glanced over. The seat was empty, but as she looked closer, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. There was an imprint, like the faint outline of someone who had once been sitting there. A sense of dread filled her, and she quickly looked away, only to find that the janitor was now much closer, standing just a few feet from her. Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. He leaned in, his cold breath brushing against her cheek as he whispered, "They never leave." The lights flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, she felt a hand brush her shoulder. She gasped, whipping around, but no one was there. The janitor had disappeared, leaving her alone in the silent, empty carriage. Jenna's heart raced as she clutched her bag, her eyes darting around the train. She wanted to get off, to escape this strange, suffocating place, but the train just kept moving, speeding through each station without slowing. She stood, moving toward the door at the far end of the carriage. Her only thought was to get as far away as possible from the seat where the imprint had been. Just as she reached the door, the train jolted to a stop. She stumbled forward, catching herself against a pole, and looked up, hoping to see an exit. But what she saw instead made her blood run cold. The door slid open to reveal a platform unlike any she had ever seen. The station was ancient, with crumbling walls covered in soot and grime, and dim lights flickering overhead. The air was thick and stifling, and the platform was filled with people, silent, still people, all staring at her. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow and vacant. They looked like passengers from another time, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, each one marked with signs of decay, as though they'd been waiting there for decades. Jenna backed away, pressing herself against the wall of the carriage, as the people began to move, stepping forward in unison, their gazes fixed on her. The train doors began to close, but before they shut completely, one of the passengers reached through, his hand brushing her arm. She felt a cold, clammy sensation, like she was touching something not quite alive. The doors shut, and the train lurched forward, pulling away from the platform. Jenna's chest heaved as she gasped for breath, clutching her arm where the stranger had touched her. She looked down, seeing faint, dark fingerprints on her skin, like the mark of someone who had long since passed. The train sped through the dark tunnel, and as Jenna looked around, she realized the carriage was no longer empty. The seats around her were filled with shadowy figures, their faces obscured, their bodies flickering in and out of view like fading memories. They sat in silence, their heads turned slightly toward her, as though they were watching her, waiting. Jenna's pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was frozen, her gaze locked on the ghostly passengers surrounding her. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the train began to slow. The lights flickered again, and the ghostly figures vanished, leaving her alone once more. The train pulled into a station, and to her relief, she recognized it. It was her home station. She stumbled toward the door, her legs shaky, her heart pounding as she waited for the doors to open. When they finally slid open, she bolted out of the carriage, not daring to look back. She ran up the stairs, out into the fresh night air, her heart racing as she put as much distance as possible between herself and the subway station. As she caught her breath, she looked back at the entrance, half expecting to see the janitor watching her from the shadows. But the entrance was empty, silent. She hurried home, locking her door behind her, vowing never to take the last train again. But as she lay in bed that night, her mind replayed the events, the hollow faces, the janitor's eerie whisper. And just as she was drifting off to sleep, her phone buzzed with a notification. Groggy, she reached for it, squinting at the screen. It was a message with no number, just a single sentence: "They never leave." Her hands shook as she stared at the words, and as she glanced toward her window, she thought she saw a shadowy figure standing outside, watching her with dark, hollow eyes.